everyone, I'm going to read you the first chapter of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So the first chapter is called Here Comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket, and this is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a very small boy whose name is Charlie. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. The whole of his family, the 6 grown-ups, go back and listen and count them. And little Charlie Bucket lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. This house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on one side, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on the other side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon a mattress on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long. It was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house or even 1 more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed little caps onto the tops of tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money. No matter how hard Mr. Bucket worked, and however how fast he screwed the caps on, he was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that such a large family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. They all looked forward to Sundays because then they all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The only thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up in shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking creamy bars of chocolate out of their pockets and munching on them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with 1 small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, On those marvellous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a wooden box that he owned, and he would treasure it as though it were a solid bar of gold. And for the next few days, he would only ever allow himself to look at it, but never touch. Then at last, when he couldn't stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate. And then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day he would take another tiny nibble, and so on and so on. And in this way, Charlie would make a 6-penny bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I hadn't yet told you about the awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching on bars of creamy chocolate right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could ever imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it simply wasn't an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolate that ever has been. And what a tremendous, marvellous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading to it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from the chimneys in a strange whizzing sound coming from deep inside. And outside the walls, for a mile in every direction, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gate of the factory, and every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly. And he would hold his nose high up in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolate smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like.